Among the European nations, Portugal, that empire of tireless navigators and explorers who completed the map of the earth, that people of farmers, sailors, and religious men, it also experiences firsthand the difficulties of the first decades of the 20th century, plunging into chaos and uncertainty, which were the distinctive features of those times. However, from those upheavals, a leader rises who will set himself apart from the typical mold of the ruling classes. He did not descend from Portuguese nobility or any royal house, nor did he come from a family with a military lineage. Rather, he was a provincial man of peasant origins who had managed to devote himself body and soul to academic life. We are talking about Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, who after many successive social crises managed to lead as head of state in Portugal, a period of peace, prosperity, and social advancement for almost 36 years. Rising to such heights through intelligence and education, his life and his work as a ruler are unlike any other. Stay with us until the end of this video. This is Arinaldo Carrillo speaking. This is La Nueva Enciclopedia, and I invite you to support us by subscribing to the channel, liking this video, and leaving your comments. We always read them all. By activating the notification bell, and above all, by sharing it with all your friends on social media, on WhatsApp, and anywhere else. Without further ado, let's start with today's video. Antonio de Oliveira Salazar was born on April 28, 1889 in Vimeiro, in the north of the country, very close to the neighboring Spanish region of Galicia. Son of Antonio de Oliveira and Maria Dores Gates Salazar, young Antonio was born into a peasant family. Although they were not on the verge of poverty, they were also far from having the wealth of other, quite affluent families. Antonio was the youngest child and his parents' only son, easily standing out from his four older sisters. Despite the circumstances, the Oliveira Salazar household always had enough resources to provide their 5 children with an excellent academic education. Little Antonio took his classes at home, under the guidance and supervision of several personal tutors, who always attested to Salazar's intelligence and dedication to his studies, qualities that were also reflected in his excellent grades. In his childhood and early adolescence, Antonio was described by his sisters as a rather thoughtful boy who preferred to go for walks in the countryside. He was also somewhat shy, but very affectionate, kind, and above all, intelligent. As Antonio grew up, discussions about his educational future became more frequent at home. At that time, it was almost impossible to send young Antonio to Lisbon to pursue a university education. Therefore, in 1905, at only 16 years old, he decided to enter the seminary in the city of Viseu in hopes of becoming a priest. These years were quite clear and enthusiastic for the young seminarian Antonio. In the seminary, he made many friendships with people who would later hold important public positions during his government, like the brothers Mario and Abel Paes de Souza and Mario de Figueiredo. In the seminary, Antonio stands out more in the arts than in the sciences, but he excels mainly in theological studies. It is also in the seminary where Antonio writes his first recorded works, which are evidence of the emergence of his early independent ideas, rooted in strong Catholicism. Around this time, however, an event occurs in Portugal that will mark a turning point in its history, and that, unknowingly, will also change the course of young Salazar's life forever. The unexpected assassination of King Carlos I of Portugal on February 1, 1908. This is where we must pause to understand not only the life of Oliveira Salazar, but also the life and history of the nation of Portugal. By the mid-19th century, the historic Portuguese monarchy which had built a considerable overseas empire, had fallen into a political game in which conservative and liberal factions, both supported by the bourgeoisie, would occasionally and consensually take turns in power, with the approval of the reigning king, giving rise to what would become known as rotativism. In response to this two-party system, the Portuguese Republican Party was founded in 1876 with the clear goal of completely eliminating the monarchy and establishing a republican regime. However, for the time being, this would be a minority force in the Portuguese political landscape, although this situation would not last long. In the 1880s and 1890s, at the height of its colonial empire, and with aims of total control over South Africa, the United Kingdom forced Portugal to give up its possessions in what are now Angola and Mozambique, to which Portugal, pressured by its economic and military weakness, agreed. The loss of its possessions caused a strong atmosphere of discontent against the rotativist parties and against the monarchy itself. The loss of its richest colonies caused a severe economic crisis, worsened by the insufficiency of the Portuguese productive system, which was one of the weakest in Europe at that time. And it is in these moments of discontent and crisis that the Republicans start gaining ground in the political scene and public opinion. Between the year 1900 and 1907, several events occurred that increasingly strained the situation in the country. The Republicans win several important municipalities, which are taken away from them by the government, arguing that they had committed fraud. The government then bans Republican publications and political associations, which leads to several protests, riots, and conflicts. And in addition, the government passes a decree that limits the legislative functions of the Cortes, and these functions were concentrated in the head of the government, João Franco. Thus, in the midst of the turbulent situation on February 1st, 1908, the King of Portugal, Carlos I, returns from his vacation in Vila Viçosa in a carriage on his way to the royal palace of Lisbon. As he was passing through the commerce square of that city, he suddenly received several gunshots that ended his life. The news of the king's death not only causes anxiety, but also marks the end of the quasi-stability that the rotativist parties and the Portuguese monarchy had enjoyed until then. From February to October, heads of government come and go, protests and disturbances are a daily occurrence, and King Manuel II, heir to the assassinated Carlos I, fails to appease the Republican factions. So in this situation of instability, on October 5th of that year, 1908, the Republicans, after several months of continuous struggle, officially managed to proclaim the First Portuguese Republic. Through a civic military uprising that involved elements of the army and the navy, sending the king into exile and promulgating a new constitution in 1911, which established a republican system for Portugal with separation of powers and universal male suffrage. However, shortly after this new stage began for Portugal, the Republic, which had been the historical aspiration seeking to put an end to the vices of the monarchy, and rotativism, the Republic quickly took on many of those same vices, turning against its own principles of freedom and democracy, generating discontent among a large part of the population, and sowing the seeds of a new conflict to come in which Salazar will have a prominent role.
Yeah.
So going back to the young Salazar, in the midst of this complex situation that Portugal was experiencing, he left the seminary for reasons that are still unclear. It is completely unknown exactly why Antonio left his religious training. However, sometime later he would acknowledge his time at the Catholic seminary. At a time when there were no other places of instruction in rural areas, was key to his academic and personal development, attributing his intellectual formation and discipline to the priests at the seminary. Having left the path to priesthood, a well-educated young Salazar would spend some time teaching at a secondary school in the same city of Viseu. However, around the fall of 1910, thanks to the financial support of his godparents and the favorable opinions of the seminary's head priests, a new opportunity came his way to move to Lisbon to study at the prestigious University of Coimbra, which was unique in the nation. It was the center of the latest knowledge in all branches of learning, and where politics and university life were almost one and the same. So Salazar began studying at the University of Coimbra in the period following the proclamation of the First Portuguese Republic, that is, between October and November of 1908, choosing to pursue a law degree. During this stage, as a student, he was nicknamed, quote, the exam-solving machine, because his academic performance and intelligence were outstanding. In 1911, Salazar joined the so-called Academic Center for Christian Democracy, a Catholic student political group, where Salazar formed friendships with prominent young politicians. At the same time, he fought against the marked anti-clericalism. He wrote fiery opinion articles on the First Republic, reflecting his early immersion in politics. In 1914, at the age of 25, Salazar graduated with a law degree, but he continued at the university. Attending lectures on economic sciences and finance, he quickly became knowledgeable in these areas and wrote several dissertations and articles on these subjects. Shortly after, due to his academic excellence, he took the chair of economics at that university in 1917 before receiving his doctorate in economic policy and finance in 1918, becoming a full professor at the University of Coimbra. In a short time, his popularity and recognition went beyond the classroom, and he began to be regarded by various political sectors, and even by the government itself, as an honest and brilliant man. It is worth noting that Salazar, throughout his life, including his later period as head of state, was a very modest man with refined habits. He always maintained a love for reading and literature, and was regarded by those close to him and by other heads of state as a very pleasant and endearing man. He had no wives or children and maintained a relatively distant relationship with his sisters, the only family members he had during his time in office. But going back to his time as a professor during this period, Salazar hardened and matured his own thinking, which could be summarized as follows. First and foremost, Salazar, due to his family tradition and early upbringing, was fervently Catholic and shared the vision of the Church's social doctrine. Regarding the economic, political, and social problems of his time, above all, guided by works such as the encyclical Rerum Novarum by Pope Leo XIII, in which he condemns both the prevailing capitalism and the threat of insurgent socialism, and he emphasizes the need to raise the standard of living for all workers. Other guiding lights of his Christian thought were theologians and philosophers like St. Thomas Aquinas, from whom he draws on ethics and the moral responsibilities of rulers. Secondly, there was his reactionary thinking, opposed to rapid and revolutionary changes in traditional aspects, promoted both by the liberal right and the Marxist and socialist left, embodied in the works of intellectuals such as Joseph de Maistre, Edmund Burke, Alexis de Tocqueville, and Gustave Le Bon. Known for their criticism of the monarchy, modernity, and their call to return to forms of government more inspired by tradition. And finally, there was his solid economic thinking, which took what was most suitable for Portugal's circumstances, from authors of different positions, from Adam Smith to Karl Marx, and contemporaries like Ludwig von Mises and John Maynard Keynes. Among other things, Salazar advocated for state intervention in the economy that could guarantee the stability which, according to him, could not be achieved by the pure forces of the free market. He also proposed the establishment of a corporatist model that would reconcile the interests of employers and workers through corporative bodies organized and supervised by the government. Another important point of his thinking was industrial and agricultural development that would allow Portugal to be self-sufficient and stop depending so much on imports. At the same time, another fundamental point of his political worldview was balance and fiscal responsibility, urging that the management of public affairs be as austere and fair as possible. The academic preparation of Salazar and the ideas that were beginning to take shape in his mind. They opened the doors to the world of politics for him, which was in turmoil at that time and would bring an unexpected future to the young professor. Salazar would work as a professor from 1918 to 1926, enough time for the First Republic of Portugal, established in 1908, to begin to crack, and to accentuate the crisis inherited from the monarchy and the rotativist parties. First of all, the Republic was characterized by unprecedented political instability, with nearly 40 different governments. In Portugal from 1910 to 1926, governments that failed to maintain continuity in public policy and were unable to implement significant reforms for the nation. On the other hand, in the Republic, various tendencies emerged that could not reach an agreement. The Republican Party, with several internal factions, the Socialist Party, and even the Monarchist Party that called for restoration. Finally, economic problems such as inflation and unemployment reach critical levels. These governments are unable to fix these problems, which generates deep discontent, not only among the people but also among the military officers of the armed forces, who had cautiously stayed away from politics. Against this backdrop, on May 28, 1926, faced with this scenario, a military uprising led by General Manuel Gomes da Costa took place, which quickly found support from garrisons in important cities such as Oporto and Coimbra. And quickly, the government of the Republic of Portugal, presided over at that time by Antonio Maria da Silva, resigned from their positions and handed over power to this group of military men, thus beginning in Portugal what has become known as the National Dictatorship. 2 days later, on May 30th, a new government was formed, presided over by José Mendes Cabezadas, which indefinitely dissolved parliament and formed a cabinet with independent civilians and military men not affiliated with the Republican Party, a party that ends up being banned just like all the other political parties. Shortly after, Gomes da Costa replaces Mendes Cabezadas, and Salazar is called to take over the Ministry of Finance in that government. And Salazar accepts on the sole condition that he is given a free hand to undertake the necessary reforms to stabilize the Portuguese economy. However, the government does not fulfill this condition, and Salazar resigns and returns once again to the University of Coimbra to continue his career as an educator. 2 years after this, in 1928, Oscar de Fragoso Carmona is elected president of the government, replacing Gomes da Costa. Carmona had the authority to appoint the prime ministers and other ministers who would accompany him during his term. As a result, they once again offered the renowned Professor Salazar leadership of the Ministry of Finance, with the promise that they would meet his conditions. Salazar accepts the position again and implements a series of measures that radically transform the economy of Portugal. First, he takes absolute control of all public spending, imposing strict austerity, which ultimately allows him to balance the state's public accounts and the public budget, and stabilize the Portuguese currency, being able to stop the devaluation of the escudo, which was the currency at the time. At the same time, he makes adjustments to price and wage policies, which help control inflation, improving the situation of many workers in terms of their purchasing power. These policies, and others like them, made Salazar's fiscal year from 1928 to 1929 the first in Portugal's recent history to result in a profitable fiscal surplus for the Portuguese people. This achievement was seen by all Portuguese people as a feat by the young Minister of Finance, making the people regard Salazar almost as a savior. At the same time, Salazar was gaining the trust of various political sectors and the military officers, who were pleased with his performance in office. For his part, Salazar was devising and shaping his political project, founding a party under his command on July 30, 1930, called the National Union, which would be the platform from which he would present his proposals to reform and readjust all aspects of Portuguese national life. And in the same way, he would fight against the opposition to this project and to the government, an opposition that, amid its internal struggles, was becoming increasingly non-existent. However, Salazar's shining moment comes on July 5, 1932, at the age of 43, when, with the government of the national dictatorship fully consolidated, President Fragoso Carmona decides to appoint Salazar as Prime Minister of Portugal, thus beginning what became known as the Estado Novo, or the New State in Spanish, which would become the tangible expression of the ideas that Salazar had cultivated in his mind throughout his life, now put into government practice. Linguística. Shortly after his appointment as Prime Minister, Salazar reformed the Constitution of Portugal, holding a referendum that achieved 99.52% approval, and this constitution came into effect on April 11, 1933. The 1933 Constitution established all the essential prerogatives for the formation and consolidation of the Estado Novo, the political regime based on the ideals previously set out by Salazar. They were also considered factors of national fragmentation that had divided the country during the Portuguese Republic. Political parties were abolished, and the National Union Party became the sole governing movement throughout Salazar's entire term. Likewise, the National Assembly was elected by direct vote of the people, and in turn, it elected the president, who also appointed the prime minister. The prime minister, under this system, was in practice the one who had the final say in government decisions and who steered the ship of state, since he could approve or repeal laws and technically control the entire public administration. Salazar managed to establish, together with the military high command and the Portuguese political class, a regime in which the president and the assembly, over the following years, came and went constantly. But Salazar, as prime minister, stood firm as a rock, always remaining in the position of prime minister. Through the different cabinets, thus serving as the center of command and order in that political regime. Salazar, throughout this entire term, had autonomy and a free hand, just as he always wanted since his years as finance minister, but now with the fate of the other branches of government also in his hands. During his first years in office, Salazar faced a series of events, such as the Spanish Civil War and World War II. He proceeded to establish a strong security and surveillance apparatus, with agencies such as the State Surveillance and Defense Police and the Public Security Police, which dismantled and imprisoned cells of political opposition, mostly made up of socialist, communist, and anarchist groups who were conspiring against the regime. Especially after World War II, Portugal, because of the facilities it provided to the Allied powers in the Azores Islands during the conflict, it gained the favor of the United States and Great Britain, who included the Portuguese nation in NATO and traded freely with it during the course of the Cold War. At the same time, Salazar, despite being seen by liberal democracies as a dictator without a uniform, managed to maintain good diplomatic relations with several countries in the international community. And returning to internal affairs, in social matters, the Estado Novo, due to the general stability that Salazar achieved in public finances, exponentially increased the value of the currency and the economy, and, therefore, raised the standard of living of many Portuguese people, while also reducing illiteracy, creating the social security and public health system, encouraging the growth of family units, creating labor laws for the protection of workers, promoting sports and culture, and creating specialized institutes for activities of this kind. And, in addition, a policy of promoting public morals based on patriotism and the teachings of the Catholic Church and its social doctrine. A key pillar for understanding the economic policy of the Estado Novo is the corporatist model that this regime follows. This corporatist model, as we already mentioned, was based on the idea that unequal individuals, such as workers and employers, before being governed by organizations like political parties, should belong to a corporation or guild, where in certain spaces they could reconcile their interests with those of other corporations through the mediation of the state, which represented national interests. In this way, the Estado Novo promoted the creation of a complex system of unions and workers' organizations, through which workers' rights were defended, who even, according to the Constitution, had a body called the Corporative Chamber, through which they could present their demands to the government and employers, and through which the state could ask corporations and unions for their opinion on the laws to be enacted. Salazar, with his vast knowledge in the economic field, continued with several policies that had been in place since his time as Minister of Finance. He continues to cut unnecessary public spending, stabilizes fiscal accounts and the state budget, and adds other measures such as regulated opening to foreign capital and investment. He manages to increase Portugal's national production, and industry and agriculture grow like never before. In addition, the foreign debt is paid off and development plans are carried out, in which the nation is modernized and major public works are built that endure to this day. In general, the achievements of the Estado Novo are referred to as those that allowed Portugal, after almost a century of crisis, to achieve the social, political, and financial stability that the nation so longed for in order to prosper economically and culturally through a long period of peace. However, suddenly, Salazar's life takes an unexpected turn. On August 3, 1968, when Salazar was 79 years old, he suffered a terrible fall accompanied by a severe blow to the head. Despite the seriousness of the fall at Salazar's advanced age, he decides to keep the accident a secret and refuses to receive medical attention. However, the consequences of the fall on Salazar's health kept getting worse until, on September 16, he suffered a stroke and had to undergo surgery. Shortly after, he suffered another stroke, which, although he survived, left him unable to govern and in a vegetative state. In view of this situation, then President Américo Tomás appointed Professor Marcelo Caetano as Prime Minister, who replaced Salazar after his 32 years as head of government. After the accident, no one dared to tell Salazar that he was no longer Prime Minister. His health worsened even more, so they made him believe that he was still governing. Finally, after 2 years fighting to survive, Antonio de Oliveira Salazar died on July 27, 1970, at the age of 81. Shortly after his death, the political opposition and military factions opposed to Salazar took advantage of the power vacuum to regroup and increasingly demand, in a more violent way, the establishment of a liberal democracy, which led to the so-called Carnation Revolution of 1974, which ultimately managed to overthrow Marcelo Caetano and bring down the last remnants of that great Portuguese Estado Novo, giving rise to the Third Republic of Portugal, which exists to this day. With the fall of Caetano, who for some was almost the heir to Salazar and the Estado Novo, the last remaining part of the government disappeared. Of the work of the man who, since 1929, had been esteemed and regarded by the majority of the Portuguese as a savior, and who, in light of his achievements and for posterity, is responsible for having given, for better and for worse, the longest period of peace and prosperity in the history of Portugal. Thank you all very much. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I remind you that you give us great support by sharing the content, leaving your comments, liking the video, turning on the notification bell, and interacting with the channel in general. Thank you all, and may God bless you.